Hey, welcome to my channel. This is Beginning Christian. So today we're going to be doing something interesting and fun, right? It'll fall in line with my video on near-death experiences. And to my surprise, there are many Christians out here who believe in this. So the video today is going to be the Bible and flat earth theory. And there's just as many Christians out there who believe in flat earth as there are who believe in near-death experiences. And this video isn't going to be designed to attack anyone or to attack their opinions, right? It's not going to be designed to degrade or to devalue anyone either, right? It's simply an exploratory topic like NDEs that I find extremely interesting. And as always, I'm interested in what the Bible teaches versus what culture or even the church teaches. So let me begin by telling you what this video isn't or won't be about, right? It's not sensationalist, so I won't be arguing about conspiracies, end-time issues, geocentrism, or the firmament, right? It's strictly about what the Bible teaches concerning the flat earth theory. And there are several verses in the Bible that flat earth theorists use to legitimize their arguments. So that's where I'll start. However, for this video, I'll be using the ESV translation for most of the verses, right? The ESV contains more of the flat earth verses than the NIV does. So one of the first categories are verses that talk about the ends of the earth or the earth having ends. So Job 28:24, for he views the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. Now, this is a clear and definitive statement about the earth having ends. The verse unmistakably says, the ends of the earth. Now, there is no disputing this. Even if I wanted to dispute, the Bible makes a clear declaration. In flat earth view, the earth has edges, right? It has distinct edges. You can find thousands of flat earth pictures on the internet, right? Flat earthers also believe that the sun and the moon only rotate around the top half of the planet. So let's explore another verse that gives us more context and a better understanding about how to interpret phrases like the ends of the earth. So Psalm 67:7. May God bless us still, so that all the ends of the earth will fear him. Now, this is a great verse because it gives us a little more clarification of what that phrase means. So flat earthers reading this verse might believe that the ends of the earth are going to fear the Lord. Now, out of context, this could mean that only the people at the ends of the earth should fear God, right? Only those people should respond to his call. However, there's a problem with this line of thinking. The ends of the earth on flat earth models are either water or uninhabitable chunks of ice, right? And this is because flat earthers believe that the South Pole isn't south of the flat earth, but instead stretched around the edge of the earth. So the edges of the flat earth are either water or frozen tundra, right? And uninhabitable except by polar bears, right? This presents us with a problem because the Bible is stating that there are people inhabiting these places. So as we explore more verses, the Bible will paint a clear picture that the earth doesn't have edges or ends. So Isaiah 45:22, turn to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. Now here's the term ends of the earth again, and God is instructing them to turn to him and be saved, right? God is speaking to distant people. He's talking to people in far-off lands, people outside of Israel, and referred to as the ends of the earth, right? He's calling them to hear the gospel and be saved. And this poses a problem for biblical flat earthers because they have to adopt this into their view, right? The earth has edges. There are people living there. And now we have to bring the gospel to them, right? Now they have to add bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth to their mission statement. So Deuteronomy 28, the Lord will bring a nation against you from afar away, from the ends of the earth, like an eagle swooping down, a nation whose language you will not understand. And this is probably the most irrefutable evidence against flat earthers. Deuteronomy is partially about the consequences the Jewish nation faces if they disobey the law of Moses, right? The law that Moses gave them. His judgment is very obvious. If you don't obey the law, I'm going to bring a nation against you from the ends of the earth. And this did happen, right? It happened with Babylon and Assyria. They each took a nation from Israel, right? One taking the northern kingdom, the other taking the southern kingdom. These are nations from the ends of the earth. Deuteronomy 28:64. Then the Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other. There you will worship other gods, gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your ancestors have known. So Deuteronomy is saying that there are nations at the ends of the earth that are going to take the nation of Israel captive and take them back to the ends of the earth. So if you believe that the ends of the earth are the edges of the map, you have to figure out historically how Israel is taken into captivity by nations living on the icy edges of the map, taken there, and then delivered back, because the Bible makes it clear that this is the nation of Babylon, right? And we see this again in Nehemiah. So Nehemiah 1:8. Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. So in this passage, Nehemiah is praying because the nation of Israel has been taken captive and now they are in exile. Right? In the ESV translation, your exiled people are at the farthest horizon is replaced with, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven. So in the flat earth theory, the uttermost parts of heaven would have to be some domain in space or somewhere near the top of the dome, right? And that doesn't make sense, though, because God is going to gather them back. So they have to be at the edge where the dome meets the ice edge. However, earlier in the passage, Nehemiah tells us where he's located, right? The citadel of Susa. Susa is over 1,000 miles east of Jerusalem. It's on the western side of Iran. So in this text, the ends of the earth and the uttermost parts of heaven would be at the western border of Iran. So this passage, along with others I've listed, cannot possibly mean that the earth has ends or edges. What we can assume, and Jesus weighs in on this, is that the ends of the earth means nations that are far from influence and perspective, far from the influence and perspective of Jerusalem. It isn't meant to be literal. So Mark 13:27, and he will send his angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of the heavens. So Jesus is saying that he's going to gather his people from everywhere. He's not saying that the earth has edges or ends. That's not the point of the passage. So in flat earth theory, the sun doesn't move from one edge to the other. Instead, it rotates or circles around the dome about a third way up. However, the Bible teaches the sun is everywhere, right? The sun touches all. Psalm 19:6. It rises at one end of the heavens and makes its circuit to the other. Nothing is deprived of warmth. So the writer of Psalms is describing the sun as rising, as ascending. More importantly, it's rising from the edge or the ends of the earth. So on flat earth models, the sun is never near the edge of the earth. It sits between the land and the dome of the earth and rotates around that surface area. So the Bible is describing an action of the sun that just doesn't correlate with flat earth theory. Now, this leads us into a discussion about the usage of the word earth in the Bible, right? The word earth doesn't always refer to the planet in the Bible. As a matter of fact, a large percentage of the time it isn't referring to the planet at all. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, this is one of the few times in the Bible where the term earth means the planet earth, right? Genesis then provides us with additional uses of the word earth that don't correlate to the planet itself, or at least a flat planet, right? The word often used in the Bible is the Hebrew word eretz, and it doesn't refer to the whole planet. Genesis 1:10. God called dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas, and God saw it was good. So that's the ESV translation. God calls the dry land earth. So earth is just dry land, nothing more. So if it's below sea level, then it's not earth. And this is one of the meanings of the word eretz. If it's below sea level, then it's not eretz. And this is how the word is used more often than not. It's seldom used to describe the entire planet. So if you continue reading through verse 11 and 12, you'll still read that dry land is often referred to as earth. Genesis 11:1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Again, this is the ESV translation. So according to flat earthers, this would mean that the planet itself speaks. Once again, the whole earth refers to many nations, many people. So far, Eretz refers to the planet, dry land, and now people. So Genesis 13:6, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. So in this passage, Eretz is used to refer to a local area of land. The next category is the footstool verses. Isaiah 66:1, thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. What is this house that you would build for me, and what is the place of my rest? Now remember, these are verses that flat earthers use to prove their theory, but when I read this, it's hard for me to imagine that God is giving me a physical and cosmological description of what the earth looks like, right? If you search flat earth images on the internet, you'll find several variations that depict the earth as almost a table with pillars, right? Pillars that are supporting the domed flat earth. It looks like an uncomfortable and strangely designed footstool. So I'm going to read the passage again and break it down in context for a better, more realistic understanding. So heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. So first of all, if we're going to believe that the earth is a footstool, then we have to believe that heaven is shaped like a throne, right? And does anyone believe this, right? We've all seen the movies where kings sit on thrones, and they usually have these huge, ornately decorated chairs that the king sits in. So this is what heaven is, right? How can a person who believes in flat earth theory not believe that heaven is a throne, but that the earth is a footstool, right? So if you're picking which piece of the verse to take literally and which piece of the verse to take figuratively, you might be creating your own doctrine or falsely creating a scenario to fit your doctrine. So secondly, this line of reasoning now gives God a human body like Mormonism. God would need feet in order to rest them on a footstool, and this is just not Christian doctrine. So Isaiah 40:12, who had measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in balance. So if we're going to read the Bible intending to give God physical characteristics, now he has hands. And how big are his hands, right? A span is the width of your hand from the edge of your pinky to the edge of your thumb. So basically, that's a span. So he's marked off the heavens with the span of his hand. So however big his hand is, that's how big heaven is. And that's not how it works, right? The book of Isaiah is mostly poetry. This is poetic language describing the sovereignty of God. So 1 Kings 8:27, but will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house I have built. So this simply means that there's no comparison to the grandeur, sovereignty, and the glory of God and that of creation. Heaven isn't a throne that God sits on, nor is it held with the span of his hand. The next category is the pillars of earth, right? So 1 Samuel 2:8, he raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. So from the flat earth perspective, the earth itself has a bottom that is supported by literal pillars. However, this verse is an analogy, right? The poor are inheriting a seat of honor. God is giving them leadership positions in the world, right? Then it says that the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. The idea here is that the pillars are the primary leaders in the world, and God exalts whoever he wants, and he'll place whoever he wants in these positions. This includes the poor, right? King David is the perfect example of this. He was the son of a poor farmer. He was a shepherd. God takes him from these lowly and humble beginnings and makes him a king. And not only does he make him the king of Israel, but he also creates in him a lineage that leads to the Messiah. So Jesus was from a line of kings. He was from the line of David. So John 26:11, the pillars of heaven tremble and are astounded at his rebuke. So here the pillars of heaven is used. So we have to remember that Job is poetry, and we'll see more of this poetry as we explore other verses. So the pillars of heaven could really just be mountains, right? The mountains jut out from the surface of the earth, and just above them are the heavens or the sky, right? It's not taken literally as if the mountains are holding up the sky. Job is just poetry, and this would be a literal translation of the passage. Now, the word pillars occur very few times in the scripture, and in every instance, it's poetic, right? We should treat it as poetry if it's meant to be poetry. So Psalm 75:3, when the earth totters and all its inhabitants, it is I who keep steady its pillars. So if you read the entire psalm for context, you'll realize, much like Samuel, that it's talking about leaders. The pillars are the leaders that God is going to stand behind, right? He's going to hold them up while they're going through turmoil. So the next category is bases and cornerstones. Job 38:4, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Once again, we need to go back to context to interpret these verses correctly. This is the end of the book of Job. All through the book of Job, Job and his friends have been complaining about each other. Job in particular has been complaining about God. In response to this, God comes to Job and delivers this long monologue that is designed to put Job in his place. God is essentially asking Job, who do you think you are? Job 38:5-7. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? Or what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? On what were its bases sunk, or who laid its cornerstones? So here we're introduced to two terms, foundation and cornerstone, right? The foundation of the earth and cornerstones. So flat earthers would interpret this as meaning there's a literal foundation, right? There's a literal cornerstone, and a globe earth doesn't explain these things, right? And the answer is context, 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 right? Never just read two verses and establish a doctrine from them, right? So Job 38:7-10. When the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy, or who shut in the sea with doors when it bursts out from the womb, when I make cloud its garments and thick darkness its swaddling band, and prescribe limits for it and set bars and doors. So if we're understanding these verses to be literal translations of the earth's physical characteristics, its topography, then we also need to acknowledge that the sea has doors and the sky has doors and bars, right? We'd also have to acknowledge that the stars sing. Now, I don't know about you, but last time I was outside at night, the stars weren't singing to me, right? They weren't singing to anybody. They weren't making noise at all. As a matter of fact, the best part of being out in the middle of the country, away from the city, is the fact that the sky is completely open and you can see the stars, right? But I've never heard them singing. So we just can't take verse 4 and build a doctrine of flat earth from that, because that doesn't explain the bars and doors, right? If it's all literal, then we have a foundation, a cornerstone, bars and doors. And I don't see bars and doors on any flat earth model. So when I travel to the west or east coast, I don't see bars and doors protecting the coastline from the waters of the ocean, right? We'd also have to assume that when God was creating the earth, he used an incredibly huge ruler or measuring tape, right? And we go back, we go back to the previous verse, where God says, who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it, right? So he stretched it across we'd also have to assume that when God was creating the earth, he used an incredibly huge ruler or measuring tape, right? He stretched it across the span of the flat earth to determine its measurements, as stated in that verse. And the truth is that the book of Job is poetry, right? It tells a story of God's sovereignty, grace, and mercy through poetry, right? God is describing his creation of everything through poetry. Job 38 is God describing how he created earth in the same way that I might explain how I built a house, right? The only difference is that it's poetic, it's beautiful. So the next category is the circle of earth verses, right? So Proverbs 8:27. When he established the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep. Now, Proverbs is poetic language, and it's personifying wisdom as if it were actually there when God created the heavens and the earth, right? Verse 29 speaks of God marking out the foundations of the earth like a surveyor marks out a perimeter or an area for a house, right? God didn't have to mark anything out because he spoke all things into existence as stated in Genesis, right? This is just poetic language to explain that God made everything well and thoughtfully, right? He just didn't make a bunch of random stuff. So Isaiah 40:22, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in. So the point here is that God is sovereign, right? The word circle in the first sentence of the verse is subject to much controversy, right? Flat earthers do not like it because a circle can either mean a globe or a sphere. And this isn't a well-defined word, or there isn't a well-defined word for sphere in Hebrew. So they may have called something a circle in lieu of the word globe or sphere. So although the word is vague and indeterminate, I don't think it's about topography, right? I don't think it's about the physical characteristic of the earth. Isaiah isn't giving us a physical description of earth, rather a description of God's sovereignty, right? When it says he sits above the circle of the earth, it's telling us that when you look at the horizon or as far as your eyes can see, God is sovereign, right? He reigns over it. He reigns over it all. It's simple, right? I wouldn't even use this verse to argue a global earth. This simply isn't enough scripture to argue topography of any magnitude, right? I would need more evidence, and definitely clearer evidence. So, if you want to argue that a circle means a flat disk, as there are in some flat earth theories, let's look at another verse where circle is used again. So Job 22:14, thick clouds veil him so that he does not see, and he walks on the vaults of heaven. So it's the exact same word for circle in Hebrew, right? It's the same word used in Isaiah 22. The earth is a circle, which means it's flat with edges, but they're not corners, right? In the flatter theory, the earth has a dome above it, right? So this means that heaven would be half of the globe, and that can use the same word in Isaiah 22 to describe it, but when it's talking about the earth, it has to mean flat, right? So this is stretching the verse well beyond its intended meaning. It means that you're not really studying the Bible. Rather, you're pushing your agenda or doctrine onto the text of Scripture. And this is where it needs to stop, right? You're looking for details to support your belief or doctrine, and they're not there. So the next category is corners of the earth. So Revelation 7:1. After this, I saw 4 angels standing in the 4 corners of the earth, holding back the 4 winds of the earth, that no wind might blow on the earth or sea or against any tree. So once again, we read in Revelation that the word earth isn't referring to the planet, right? If it was meant in reference to the planet, the sea wouldn't be mentioned separately, right? You can't assume that every time you see the word earth, it means the entire planet. Whether your earth is flat or round, it just doesn't refer to that every time. In this context, as in many others, it just means the ground, right? The dry ground that people live on. So let's address the 4 angels standing in the 4 corners. Now this is sketchy as well because some flat earth models don't have corners, right? Some flat earth models are just a circular model with a dome over it. So, the flat earth has a round or circular diameter. So some flat earth models have a round or circular diameter. So how do you get around this, right? You build a flat earth that has corners like a table, but is still circular within that corner periphery, right? It just gets confusing, and it has to be extremely confusing for the flat earthers. And the Bible uses all these terminologies throughout Scripture, and in such different ways, you would need a very convoluted flat earth to successfully meet all the biblical topographical and cosmological descriptions. So in the King James Version, the phrase four quadrants is used instead of four corners. And the four corners are just areas of the earth. So Job 37:3, under the whole heaven he lets it go, and his lightning to the corners of the earth. So this is another corners verse. And this one does give you some justification for a flat earth model. Revelation 7:1 also supports this as well. However, Isaiah 11 refutes all this. So Isaiah 11:12, he will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. So God is going to gather his people from the four corners of the earth. However, on most flat earth models that have corners, there's nothing there, right? The corners exist outside the known realm of the planet. And if you're not a flat earther and you find this interesting, I really encourage you to go onto the internet, because there's several variations of the flat earth model. And as I was looking through them, they're confusing, because each one is designed to meet the justification or to meet the requirements of a different flat earther. So if you have time and you think it's interesting, you should look at a couple of them. So the corners exist outside the known realm of the earth. They're like empty space. So God is redeeming his people from a completely abandoned, completely desolate area. And this just doesn't make sense. And Jesus addresses this as well in Matthew 24:31. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So the four winds are just winds from four different directions, right? From one end of heaven to the other just means from everywhere. So he's going to gather everyone from everywhere. Heaven doesn't have ends, and this isn't a cosmological description. So next is the foundation of the earth verses. So Micah 6:2, hear you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth, for the Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. So once again, the Bible isn't giving us cosmological or topographical descriptions of what the world or the heavens look like. Isaiah 51:16, and I have put my words in your mouth and covered you in the shadow of my hand, establishing the heavens and laying the foundations of the earth, and saying to Zion, you are my people. Job 38:4, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. So if the earth has a foundation, why can't that foundation just be more earth, right? According to modern science, the core of the earth is 4,000 miles beneath our feet. So why can't that be foundation, right? Why can't thousands of miles of earth be the explanation, right? This would fit this would fit a globe earth theory as much as it would a flat earth theory, and you don't need pillars or any other type of structure. You just need foundation, right? It's Occam's razor. Occam's razor, simply put, is pick the easiest or most logical explanation first. That's what Occam's razor basically is. It's more complicated than that, but what it boils down to is just pick the easiest explanation first. So the story of Job contains every phrase, term, and word that describes a flat earth theory, right? Bases, a cornerstone, bars and doors. Unfortunately, none of it's literal, right? There aren't bars and doors holding back the waters of the seas and the oceans, and that can be clearly seen, right? I mean, flat earthers will say, well, you, like a flat earther would say to me, you have never been to space, so you don't know if the earth is flat or a globe. And they would be right. I've never been to space. However, I've been to the East Coast. I've been to the West Coast. I've been to England, right? Seen that. I've been to Portugal. Seen that. And I've never seen bars or doors holding back um, the seas or the oceans, right? So that I can prove. So when God speaks about laying a foundation, he means that the earth is secure, right? He's made a stable, secure planet for us to live on. That's the idea, right? The Bible is giving God credit for things that we don't understand and can't take credit for. So next is water under the earth. So Psalm 136:6. To whom who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever. So many scholars believe that this is many scholars, even flatter scholars, believe that this is revealing a secondary water supply, right? Not the oceans, but a deeply hidden water supply far beneath the mantle of the earth itself, right? So there's earth, then there's foundations, then there's pillars, then there's this magical, undiscovered water supply, like Journey to the Center of the Earth, where the guys go to the center of the earth, and there's a whole ecological system down there with dinosaurs and fantastic other fantastic creatures, and just a whole imaginative world of things that haven't been discovered, right? So then there's the water supply, and then there's more foundation and more pillars, and it just gets wild and really difficult to follow. So Exodus 24:4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. So the context here is the Ten Commandments. God's telling the Israelites not to make idols of anything, whether it's in heaven, in the earth, or in the water under the earth. So in context, the water under the earth is the ocean, seas, lakes, etc., right? Any body of water anywhere on the planet. And this is important because one of the gods that pagans worshipped was Dagon. Now, Dagon was the god who presided over the deep ones, and they were an amphibious humanoid race that inhabited the ocean. And Dagon is often depicted as a man wearing a fish costume, a merman, or a full-on amphibian-like creature, like the creature from the Black Lagoon. So whichever picture you look at, he was a fish. And the writer H.P. Lovecraft would later popularize him in the 20th century. So if God was commanding his people not to make idols, he would certainly include the ocean and other bodies of water, because as I previously stated, people were worshiping Dagon at that time. And Dagon was a fish god, right? So God's saying, hey, you don't make idols of anything, whether it's a fish god, a volcano god, Zeus, Aphrodite, it just doesn't matter. You don't make idols of anything. So, if God was commanding his people not to make idols, he would certainly include the ocean and other bodies of water. And the ancient Israelites, they had no idea as to the extent of creatures that lived in the oceans. So God knew that they would be tempted to make an idol if some primordial amphibian crawled out of the water or was seen in the water. They just didn't understand. They didn't know what resided in the water. So the bottom line was, just don't make idols, right? So Psalm 24:1-2. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein, for he has founded it upon the seas and established it upon the rivers. Now, the phrase water under the earth is strange for us to understand because we don't think of the earth as the ground that is dry and above sea level. However, this is what first century Jews and Greeks thought of the word earth, right? They didn't necessarily think of the earth being 4,000 miles thick with a molten iron core. They thought of it as the dry, inhabitable land on top, and that is above sea level, right? This line of thinking lends credibility and reality to statements that describe the earth being above or upon the waters, right? It's made even more obvious by the phrase established upon the rivers. We don't really think that the earth is created above or upon rivers, right? When you hike along trails or you're just looking out in the woods and you see a river, you see the earth that rises up around the river, right? Because rivers naturally erode land, right? They degrade land, so they virtually dig tunnels under the earth or below the earth, right? You know you're safe because water is generally below your feet or below the earth, right? Now, when water's above the earth, right, then you panic because that's called a flood, right? So if you're out on your front porch and all of a sudden water comes rushing down your street, you don't just sit on your porch, right? You panic because water's not supposed to be there. Water is literally not supposed to be above the ground for us unless it's raining or it's some kind of catastrophe, right? A flood, a dam's broken, something's happened. So this is not talking about deep, secret underground rivers like Journey to the Center of the Earth or something like that. You know, all throughout the Bible, God separates the water from the land, right? He did it in Genesis, and he did it in the story of the flood with Noah, right? The oceans and rivers are the water underneath the earth. It's just that simple. Revelation 27-8. And when the 1,000 years are ended, Satan will be released from his prison and will come out to deceive the nations that are at the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Their number is like the sand of the sea. So when Satan is released, he'll gather a whole bunch of people to rally in war against God and Christ, right? His nations are at the four corners of the earth, which just means they're all over the earth, right? If you're a flat earther, you have to believe that there are massive nations in the uninhabitable lands of the earth, right? There's going to be nations of millions of people living in these tiny corners, and Satan is going to gather them to fight. So were these people born in the corners, or did they just migrate there to be with others of their own mindset? You know, wouldn't we know it? So finally, we're going to look at what is considered the best flat earth verses available, right? And these are what flat earthers offer as the best. So Daniel 4:11, the tree grew up and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. And then Daniel 4:20, the tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. So we've already established that the end of the whole earth, when used in Scripture, doesn't mean the edges of the earth, right? I think I've provided enough evidence to prove that. It just means from far away or at a great distance. More importantly, verse 11 is King Nebuchadnezzar describing a dream that he had to Daniel, right? It's a dream. Daniel 4:10, the visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. So this is King Nebuchadnezzar clearly describing what he is doing when the vision came to him. He was sleeping in bed, right? This isn't a cosmological or topographical revelation that states the physical nature of the planet. It's not a flat earth verse. It's a dream. Yet this is one of the best verses for their argument, right? So in 4:11, King Nebuchadnezzar is describing his dream. And in 4:20, Daniel is saying it back to him so that he understands what King Nebuchadnezzar is telling him. Like my wife does it to me all the time to make sure I understand what she said to me. So Matthew 4:8, again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdom of, sorry, it's like 4:43 in the morning. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. So this is Jesus's 40-day temptation in the wilderness just after being baptized by John the Baptizer. So the devil takes him, Jesus, up to a high mountain and shows him everything, right? All the kingdoms and nations that existed at that time on this flat earth model. The tallest mountain, he takes him to the tallest mountain in Israel, right? Satan's temptation of Jesus lasted 40 days. So everywhere that Jesus went with the devil, they walked, right? There's no evidence that that they flew or were flown, right? There's no evidence of any other assisted means of travel, right? They didn't teleport. They didn't just mysteriously appear places, right? Jesus walked as he always did. Now, the tallest mountain in Israel is Mount Hermon, and it's in the northern part of the country. Now, this is too far of a journey for Jesus to make in 40 days and still participate in all of Satan's temptations. Jesus is currently south of Jerusalem in the wilderness where John the Baptizer was evangelizing. So let's look at the highest mountains near him or in the general area. Most of the mountains near Jerusalem are not higher than 2,000 feet. And for us in America, that's not high, right? Certainly not high enough to see every kingdom and nation on the planet. First, second, third century Jews reading this would automatically know that there isn't a mountain high enough to sustain this, right? Most of the local Jews have probably climbed these mountains at one time, so they wouldn't have believed this, right? Even if the world is flat, you can't just look out from a mountain in America and see China, right? You can only see so far. So the only way Jesus could see all the nations and kingdoms of the world is through some supernatural power. We know Jesus has supernatural sight, and we know the earth isn't flat because one story in the Bible addresses both. John 1, 47 through 50. Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said of him, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." Now, if the earth was flat, Nathanael wouldn't have been surprised that Jesus saw him. If the earth was flat, Jesus wouldn't have mentioned seeing him under the fig tree because Nathanael knows it. Nathanael knows it would have been easy for him to be seen. But clearly, it shocked Nathanael, right? It wouldn't have made Nathanael believe that he was the Son of God if he saw him across a flat earth, right? The first century Jew would know that you can only see so far no matter what shape the earth is. So why did Satan take Jesus to a very high mountain, right? It's theological versus topographical. The Old Testament consistently documents revival among the Jews. They would fall away from God for one reason or the other, suffer some great calamity, and then come back to God. However, they were guilty of one sin that would consistently follow them through this process, and it's called the high places. The kings of Israel would have revivals to bring the Jews back to God, but they would never remove the high places. The high places were altars to false gods that were placed on the mountaintops around Jerusalem. They would offer animal sacrifices to these false gods on the high places. And so Jesus is taken up to a high place with its sacrilegious altar, and Satan tempts him to worship him. So if you're worshiping anything or anyone else other than God, you're worshiping Satan and his demons. So that's why that's why Satan would have taken Jesus to a high place, or to the top of a mountain. So Jesus rebukes Satan. Ultimately, the wilderness temptations are about Jesus succeeding where the Israelites failed, right? They failed in the wilderness when it came to trusting that God would feed them and take them to the promised land. And they failed in remaining faithful, right? They just failed. And this is a picture of Jesus overcoming temptation and succeeding in being perfectly sinless. So I hope this has been fruitful for you. Like I said, if you're a flat earther, I'm not here to convince you to not be a flat earther. I'm just here to convince you that the Bible doesn't teach flat earth theory. So if you're going to be a flat earther and you believe that the earth is flat, by all means, please believe the earth is flat. Just don't use the Bible to try to preach to others that the earth is flat. So I hope everyone found this fruitful. Have a blessed day. Thank you for watching. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button.